Welcome, everyone, to the Building Efficiency Resources podcast, the BERcast. This is episode 4. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the integration of the RESNET Carbon Index into Ekotrope modeling software. What are the major implications for that today and into the future for energy raters, builders, and the industry at large? Sammy, how you been? How you doing?
I'm doing awesome, Chris. How are you?
I'm
excited
okay,
to
thanks.
be going into the 4th episode here.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're starting to kind of figure this thing out, aren't we?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of good feedback. A few more people this week gave me a call and said they really enjoyed it. So looking forward to it growing, and we keep doing what we're doing. I think it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I don't have a ton of news this week to get us all kick started, but Sandy, I know you've been on the road a little bit. You've been to the Northeast, and now you're going to be down in the Southeast and a few other places. Why don't you tell us all the different places you've been here in the last couple months, and kind of the connections you were able to make?
Sure. So let me see. Let me think how far I want to go back. I was at the Greenbuild Conference in Washington, D.C. at the end of September. That was really good. I really enjoyed that conference, actually. Got to meet a lot of people. I spent some time with Maggie Leslie, our green building manager there. We got to we met up with some of our customers, and it was enjoyable. I probably could have lived without all the rats walking down the sidewalk, but I mean, other than that, which is kind of I guess I should expand on that. So I'm sitting outside talking to my wife on the phone, and I see what I think to be squirrels running around. And next thing you know, I look over and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not a squirrel. Yeah, that's a rat. And I proceeded to see that the next couple of mornings outside of a brand new hotel. Hotel was great. But I was a little shocked at the amount of critters we had running around there. But other than that,
Thanks for the explanation. I was at first thinking that you were putting down some of our congressional representatives there in Washington.
Well, I mean, I did tell them to go back to Congress, but they didn't listen.
In addition to going to Washington, D.C. for Greenbuild, you also found yourself up in the Northeast at the NESE conference for the first time. Isn't that right?
I did. Yeah, first time I've been to that one, actually. Actually ran into one of our guests from the last episode, Matt Kaplan there.
Oh, nice.
It was good. Yeah, it was good to hang out and spend a little time together. That was that was different. It was a smaller, I would say a smaller conference, but a lot of people there, a lot of more vendors than I think actual, crowd. But it was interesting because it was, it wasn't building energy, but it was product, it was energy efficiency, it was solar, it was like ground source heat pump. I mean, it was all kinds of stuff in there that they were talking about. And I made a lot of really nice connections in there, actually. Met some people that I look forward to continuing the conversation with. And, I was in and out quick. I got there at 1 a.m. in the morning and left at 5 p.m. the next night. But so no rats, though. No rats. So one for New York, right?
Bonus. All right, New York. Go New York.
And then this week, tomorrow, I'm headed to Atlanta for the SEIA conference, the Southeast Energy Summit. Looking forward to that. I've been to that one numerous times, but really looking forward to meeting everybody there. A lot of some of our constituents should be there, and we should have make a lot of great connections there and talk a lot of great energy efficiency. There's a lot of great breakout sessions. So I'm looking forward. I'm really looking forward. It's been a couple of years since I've been to this one, so I'm looking forward to revisiting. But yeah, man, I've been traveling, man, a little bit here lately.
Yeah, me too this summer. I've done quite a bit on behalf of BER. One of the big things that we've been doing that's exciting is mainstreaming a live in-person RESNET 310 HVAC grading training. So we have partnered with a few organizations and have taught 2 classes in Portland, Oregon, 2 classes in Denver, Colorado, 1 class in Florida, and we're going to have a class in Houston coming up in the next couple weeks as well. So That's been really exciting to get out and teach that class on the road, get the people hands-on with some tools that they've never really used before. And we're excited to come to y'all. If you got a class that you think that you'd like to fill, with some students who want to get trained up to be able to really understand how to practically apply the HVAC grading system, definitely hit us up. We'd be excited to, provide that for you all. So,
And just as an added note that you probably don't know is that I'm working on one in Massachusetts right now too.
nice,
So
excellent.
a lot
Okay.
of neat stuff going on with the 310.
Yeah, especially, in Massachusetts, there's a heavy drive towards electrification in the state, and the use of HVAC grading with heat pumps is actually extremely potent within the RESNET HERS index. So definitely worthwhile in order to earn that credential to be able to grade heat pump systems in cold climates, as well as air conditioners in hot climates as well. Those are the kind of the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to HVAC rating.
Massachusetts is the second most energy efficient state in the United States. Did you know that?
Yeah. What's number one?
Utah. I would have never guessed that.
Wow.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But yeah, I think it's exciting. I think we have some exciting travel coming up too. I mean, I'm going to be at the Building Performers Association's Massachusetts event coming up 2 weeks after that. And then the week directly after that, which is the 13th, we're going to be at the RESNET conference out in California. So
Yeah, the
we'll be
band's
hanging
back
out a lot,
together.
Chris.
Yeah,
I'm
the
telling you.
band will be back together in San Diego. I think everybody is excited to get together. And if you come hit us up while we're there, we may even have a BERcast hat for you.
Yeah.
Come tell us that you listen to the pod, and we'll hook you up. So, Sandy, what else you got? Any other kind of juicy tidbits around the industry?
Yeah, it was kind of a quiet compared to most recent news in the last couple of podcasts. It's been kind of quiet, but I did run across a couple of interesting articles that I thought were worth bringing up. And the one is that over the last year, energy efficient workforce has grown by over 2%. Now, that does take into account everything from energy efficiency measures all the way into the grid, right? So, but it is on the move, and it's the most it's grown since 2008. And it's anticipated the workforce to be able to grow by over 6% this year. So, good news from a standpoint of just being in the energy efficiency grid. There's growth. Lots of money going on, lots of code stuff, lots of energy efficiency. So I thought it felt good to read that. There's over 2.4 million Americans that hold energy efficiency related jobs in the United States. Now, obviously, that's not HERS raters, but I just thought that it's exciting to see. In the article I read, talked a lot about the push towards electrification and energy efficiency, and actually, for once, as a general article, actually brought up the building industry. So, it's exciting to see those things. But I think that led me to another article, which was I'm going to ask you a little question here. It's going to be we're going to have a quiz. Where do you think the least amount of energy efficiency exists in the United States?
State or
Region. Let's go region.
I would probably say it'd be where I live in the upper Midwest. That would be my guess.
You are absolutely incorrect.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good.
The least efficient areas in the United States are the Southeast and the Southwest,
Oh,
which
geez.
I found shocking
Okay.
because, of the cooling climate and the fact that it's probably definitely dominated electric in Florida where I live, right? But I was really surprised to hear that. And
I would have also thought too, from just like having relatively newer building stock. My answer wasn't just to dogpile on my own region here, but yeah, you think about like where I live in Detroit, which isn't so different than Chicago or Fort Wayne or Cleveland or Buffalo. Our housing stock is pretty old, and yeah, there's been some renovations, but a lot, like my house again, had no insulation, not one stitch of insulation in the entire building when I bought it. And probably every other house in my neighborhood is just about the same way.
sure. And Michigan's 18th.
Okay.
So it's kind of middle of the pack, right? But what's shocking is when you come down here, right? Like South Carolina, West Virginia, Alabama, it's the whole smile, you know? And I was really kind of like surprised to see that in a way.
Now, is this
Um,
measured or is this policy scoring? What's their rubric and methodology?
well, I think it's both measured and it's from a standpoint of renewables.
Okay.
Which,
Okay.
if you think about renewables, like you would think it would be dominated in the southeast and the southwest, right? I mean, it's the Sunshine Belt, right? So I just thought it was interesting. I thought it was 48. Alaska and Hawaii were omitted from the rankings because of insufficient data. That's not a surprise. Um, but like South Carolina was the worst.
Hmm.
Which I found to be very interesting. But if you look in here, you got all your southern states right through here. Um, you know, uh, my state, Florida, is actually 22nd.
Okay.
But anyway, I thought that was just interesting. Some interesting tidbits there. Nothing earth shattering or shaking, but we got a long way to go. That's
Yeah, I
all I
guess
can
so.
say.
Yeah, yeah. So keep it up, PERS Raiders. Keep working with your builders. We're gonna build ourselves into a better, more efficient future, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Okay.
All right.
Um,
Well,
well,
I
well, we're
think.
gonna go ahead and then I guess cruise forward into part two, where we're gonna be discussing the carbon index.
Awesome.
All right. So Sandy, you know, some writers probably haven't even heard of this, but the ResNet has adopted a standard for calculating a carbon index score. Basically, like the HERS index, it is a scoring system that would be used to compare a reference home to a rated home, but specifically for the purpose of trying to depict the emissions intensity of the home. So this standard was released in 2022, so it's still pretty new. It has been in both energy gauge as well as REM rate, but here at BER, a lot of our raters use Ekotrope as their preferred software, as does a lot of the industry. So, the fact that now it's been incorporated into Ekotrope as of this past month is kind of a big deal because now raters can, start to dive in and kind of see what this means.
Well, I
So,
think the truth of it, Chris, is that Ecotrope has over 80% of the market, so this is a big deal.
it's a big deal for sure, so now it's kind of going out of the theoretical and more into the real for most people. So just really quickly, what is this? Well, it's a first of kind carbon index that addresses greenhouse gas emissions. It works on an hourly basis, and the way that it is intended to function, like, again, it's kind of like the HERS rating, so you take a HERS rating, you can put it through the software, produces a carbon index score that's compared to the reference home. Here's the thing that's important to know is that the reference home is always an electric basis. So the reference home is always an all electric home versus with the ResNet HERS index calculation, it's a fuel neutral calculation. It doesn't, if you got a house with gas appliances or heating and water heating systems, then basically you're going to be compared against a reference home with gas systems. If you have an all-electric home, then it's compared against an all-electric home. And if you have a mix, then basically it's sort of it's compared, your gas furnace versus another gas furnace, your electric water heater versus another electric water heater, etc. So this is a little bit different insofar as the basis is all electric. Getting into kind of like the juicy details, the way that this really intends to do the basis of comparison is it's looking at this scenario of a future, from today until 2050, basically, with low renewable energy costs. So basically, the idea is that over time, we're going to have increasingly low costs of renewable energy. It's looking at a long run basis of emissions. So it's not just looking at what is it today for emissions, and it's not just looking at it like what might it be in 2050, but it's looking at it from like the home and its emissions from now until 2050. And if you were to average all of those emissions, taking into consideration the combustion emissions as well as the pre-combustion. So pre-combustion would be like the amount of emissions that come from the manufacture and distribution of that energy source. And so that's kind of the underlying science of the emissions. So that's important to note because, some of the emissions rates, that are within this scenario, they're sort of, number one, they're hypothetical. We don't know what's going to happen. Sandy and I were just talking about this earlier this week. The Earth axis could tilt, and all of a sudden,
hopefully not.
Hopefully not. But we don't know. And all of a sudden, the emissions profile would change because the climate would change dramatically potentially. So there could be some other type of remarkable technology that sort of comes out of nowhere that we're all blessed with that could give us, free and clean energy, in perpetuity that we just can't see today. Maybe those mummified, bodies from Peru wake up, and give us the key to our future salvation here on planet Earth. Again, this is important because the other way to look at emissions is today, right? So, this is the EPA's grid-wise or e-grid profiler. What it does is it means to basically break up all of the national grids into a map so that you can profile any one grid. I live in Michigan. I live in Detroit. That's right, Detroit. Hometown boy, right here, living in the city.
Here we go.
Yeah. Well, more on that later, Sandy. You and I are going to catch up on that later. But here in Michigan, believe it or not, for being the number one source of fresh water in the whole planet, surrounded by the Great Lakes, frankly speaking, our grid kind of stinks. We have a very high emissions grid relative to the national case. Here we go, carbon. This is Michigan's grid versus the national grid. We're not doing so hot, basically. We still have a lot of coal within our grid, and hey, I'm not necessarily trying to throw any fuel or, under the bus. I'm just showing what the EPA is showing in terms of numbers here. So, for this reason, our grid looks different than if you were to say go to New England, and take a look at Vermont and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and all the rest like that. All of a sudden their grid has, more natural gas overall, and more nuclear, more hydro, and honestly some more renewables within the profile. And for that reason, they have a lot lower emissions than on a national basis.
Which kind of goes contrary to your normal thought, right? Because anybody that thinks Northeast thinks fuel oil. You know what I mean? Especially if you've been around the block for a while. And it's actually kind of surprising to me when I saw that.
Well, this is the electrical grid. So
no, I know, but I mean, fuel oil is used in, it was used in the production of this stuff along with coal and natural gas. I just found it interesting that New England's profile, being in a cooling climate, was like that. I thought it was an interesting fact.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. So, again, going back to this NREL scenario generator, which this is sort of the database by which all the data was predicated for the carbon index, we can see the long-term nominal sort of emissions rates for any given area. And you can see, well, here in Michigan, 411 kilograms per megawatt hour versus if we were to go to Massachusetts, 129.
Wow.
So Massachusetts is in a lot better shape than Michigan is long term, and then let's go to another place. So we look here at the scale. Let's go to Iowa.
people wouldn't think this necessarily, when they think about Iowa. I don't know that people think a lot about Iowa, but I've been privileged to actually go there quite a bit. BER has a lot of raters in Iowa that have been doing work for a long time, and so I've gotten the privilege to know the state. There's actually a lot more to it than what people assume. They assume just a bunch of cornfields and that's it. And honestly, there's a lot more going on in Iowa than people would assume. And one thing that's going on is that there's an increasingly high concentration of wind generation within the electrical power grid.
So hey, we just saw that, Chris.
I know. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Sandy and I were out there visiting some customers out, boots on the ground there in Iowa, and we got to see it firsthand. So, for this reason, sorry to say, Massachusetts, but Iowa's got you beat. Iowa's got, long-term an ostensibly cleaner grid if this NREL data is to believe. So, looking at the RESNET Carbon Index in meaningful terms, I just ran like a random scenario house in Ekotrope. It's kind of like, a decent house. HERS 62, this might be kind of considered to be kind of like an average new construction in Michigan or somewhere around that. So this is with all gas appliances. So this house with all gas appliances gets a 62 on the HERS index and then a 77 on the carbon index. So, the HERS index looks better than the carbon index, but, they're a reasonable approximation of one another. And the house is predicted to use about $1,600 of energy per year. I updated my utility libraries to reflect EIA, data. So I'm looking at real data for the region. Well, then if we go ahead and change it from gas appliances, gas furnace, power vented water heater, gas stove, gas dryer, to electric appliances, sort of not the world's greatest heat pump, 16 SEER 9 HSPF, but that's kind of like a standard, like ducted heat pump, that might, replace a gas-fired furnace, as well as, kind of just a standard water heater, electric. I didn't want to go for really fancy stuff, Mitsubishi high-performance cold climate heat pumps and, heat pump water heaters. Why? Well, because I wanted to do kind of almost like an apples-to-apples cost comparison of realistic equipment that might go into the house that a builder might choose. So, under this scenario, the HERS index goes up 7 points to a 69, but the carbon index comes down. And so now the two are equal. But, so that's kind of cool. You look at that and you go, all right, well, maybe it makes sense to go electric in Michigan because the HERS index suffered a little bit, but the carbon index got better. So that's not so bad. Sandy, is there anything that jumps out to you, though, in this data if we're looking at Michigan?
Yeah, the annual electric bill went up tremendously.
Yeah,
$1,300.
Yeah, we went up from about $1,600 to about $3,000 per year. So that's an astute observation. And to me, this is one of, I think, the challenges of looking at the carbon index in isolation, because, I understand, we can say, well, I want to get greener over time. I want to make good decisions for today and for the future. But at least here in Michigan, the cost of electricity is actually quite high. And in comparison to natural gas, just the cost per BTU is exceptionally high. So, Sandy, if you were in my shoes and if I were a builder who was going to build a house here in Michigan, I didn't want to go totally crazy. I wanted to build a good home, but not necessarily a super insulated passive house. What would you take away maybe from this information?
It depends on who your buyer is, right? I think, if you're building low income or entry level housing, cost of ownership has a serious effect on your ability to sell the home, right? And to get people in those homes. So I think that to me, if I'm building high end, luxury type homes, then I don't think it really matters to people who can afford it and have a real big green conscience. I think it puts a crisis, a dilemma, or a dilemma in front of the builder if they're building more entry level or affordable type housing, because again, cost of ownership weighs heavily in the ability for someone to be able to own the home.
Yeah, no doubt, and I see this as being something fundamentally important for the affordable housing sector, thinking about, government funded, LIHTC projects, low income housing tax credit projects. So, again, it's supposed to be affordable housing.
Right.
So if these homes, these relatively simple homes were, being built as part of, some type of LIHTC funding, and then all of a sudden, the cost of ownership goes up. I mean, this is almost like an 80% increase in the cost of ownership. While the carbon intensity of the building certainly went down, I think it's something we really got to consider, because that's something we've always tried to sell in this industry, right, Sandy? That, hey, build more energy efficient and, your bills are going to go down.
Yeah, that's the whole idea behind energy efficient mortgages, right? I mean, the cost of ownership swings. So I think it's a great point you bring up here. And I think that it's I think in reality, if we're going to push for electrification, we're going to have to do it at a more economical scale, I think, is number one, right? I mean, there has to be technologies or improvement in technology, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that at the end. But, I think that's number one, right, is the cost, to produce, electricity has to come down some way. And whether it's through technologies or, like you said, the Peruvian people come alive and give us a magic pill. I mean, I don't see any other way of driving it. I mean, at this point, again, with investment and all this investment over the next 10 years, we may see that actually playing field even out, hopefully. But to me, this is a giant dilemma for, and then you have the whole fight between, we haven't even talked about this part yet, but the ESG faction of this versus the cost for the homeowner. And, I think there's a little bit of a tug there, and I don't have the answer. I don't know if you do, but I don't, other than technology and improvement of the grid in a more efficient, cost-effective manner,
Yeah, and this is a topic that we're planning to explore a lot more on the BERcast, this emerging topic of, the nexus between carbon intensity and pollution intensity and cost. And, our drive as an industry from a policy level to move towards electrification and the opportunities involved in that, but also some of the really meaningful challenges. And to a certain extent, I almost wonder whether or not, the popular sort of narrative that's being put out there about replace your furnace with a heat pump, like that's really an oversimplification of a much more intellectually and data intensive decision that needs to be made. Because I've had people here, customers in Michigan that I know, that are all in on, doing the right thing. They want to transform their home and make good decisions to make their homes more climate resilient. And so, of course, they want to put in heat pumps. But I've had these customers who have chosen to do that, and then all of a sudden, their bills are 2 or 3 times as much as they were expecting that they were going to be, and then all of a sudden they're kind of like, is this really scalable? And so honestly, I've kind of pump the brakes a little bit on electrification, at least here in Michigan. Not saying that we shouldn't do it, but I try to give people a more nuanced explanation. But more on that topic later.
Well, I think when you and I were talking about this, Chris, one of the things we said is, is that gas stove really killing everything compared to, what I mean? And I think I think you're right. We need to talk about this in probably a whole nother podcast. But there are some real questions being raised when you look at this, you know. And the other thing I would say is when customers want to do that, you know, my first question would be, well, did they energy model it out before they looked at it? You know what I mean? I mean, cost does come. Everybody has a cost now. You know, there's a different, cost factor to somebody that buys a Mercedes versus somebody that buys a Hyundai, right? But everybody does have a cost ceiling and a cost factor. And, as much as we want to do good, at what point do we price it out of the market, or make it so doesn't make sense for someone to do it? And I mean, part of it is encouragement, right? I mean, part of it is the encouragement of hopefully saving the planet and, not getting raked over the coals at the same time,
Yeah, I think that's really the goal. Well, like I say, more on that in the future. We definitely plan to have ongoing sort of topics that are discussing about, this position where we're in, where we believe that electrification is the long-term strategy for success. But what does it mean in 2023, 2024? Let's take this same home, though. So this is, again, Climate Zone 5. This is Detroit. And I'm going to switch it over to Des Moines, Iowa. And so this is the same thing. This is the electric example. So, what's interesting is, you go from Des Moines to Detroit, 69 on the HERS index, 69 on the carbon index. For the all-electric example, it's the exact same. Other thing you'll notice is that the cost came down quite a bit because in Iowa, the relative cost of electricity is actually quite a bit lower. This, again, exact same home, exact same equipment. Now let's take a look at the gas example. And this is where it's a huge difference. So the HERS index is the same as the Michigan example, 62 versus a 62 in Michigan. But the carbon index is 100 points higher than in Michigan when using gas equipment.
Wow.
How can that be, Sandy? How is that even possible?
Well, I mean, it's apparently the gas, right? I mean, it has to be. I mean, there's no other reason to that. But to me, it's like, I don't know. That's a good question. It has to be the consumption or the usage of the gas. But go up 100 points or more? That seems
so
to
again,
be,
going back to my point earlier.
Again, go ahead.
The basis is electric, right? And so the reference home's electric, and so the basis is electric. And then going back to, what we looked at before, Iowa's grid here, which is this grid, has a lot of wind in it, 35%.
So the reference home is so much more economical that it's skewing the number.
Yeah, exactly. Today, actually, Iowa's grid still, compared to the national, is more, carbon intensive. But again, we're looking at a 50-year scenario. And so what I guess I'm reading this, and I don't work for NREL, I'm not that kind of a big data scientist, but what I'm assuming is that they're just projecting that over time there's going to be more wind and probably more storage of that wind energy. Can we capture it?
Which that would be interesting to find out how they made those calculations based on what factors,
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to go get my prescription glasses and before I start looking at that data. But long story short, all of a sudden now from a carbon intensity, this kind of makes it seem like doing business as usual in those upper plain states might be the wrong thing to do. And again, there is a cost difference, about $1,400 per year for the gas example versus about $1,900 for the all electric example. So it's not quite as stark. That's still about a 30 to 40% increase in annual energy costs, which to me is not insignificant. I mean, given that the cost of everything in America and the world really has gone up with inflation and whatnot. The concept that, again, if we go back to, affordable housing, but not even just affordable housing, just rank and file American life, the idea that someone's bills are going to go up $50 a month so that they can have a carbon resilient home. I don't know. I mean, is it a values question? But I think it's something, if I were a builder who is conscientious, it might make me start to kind of perk up and look at this. What do you think, Sandy?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at this case by case, area by area, grid by grid, I think it will come down to that. It's going to have to if they're going to manage this from the SG standpoint, right? So, because look, not unlike averaging a 178, if you're a primary Midwest builder, that's going to hurt your whole footprint, especially if you're corporate from an ESG standpoint. So it's like, will that convince them to push into electrification, even though there's a cost swing? I mean, $50 a month sounds like a lot of money, but in today's environment, it's really not, compared to some other options. But I would say that it definitely presents a dilemma for the builder, because if they're not looking at this data, say you're a national builder, I mean, you're looking at, data across a large scope, where now you may have a lot of the same building practices using the same types of equipment in certain areas. This might actually push you to change the way you're actually building, if you're trying to gain as much foothold as you can from an ESG standpoint. So I think it has a lot of cause and effect, looking at it in this way. And I wonder, I would hope that as this becomes more prevalent and people start to use it, that people really start looking at it that way. And I mean, I can't say you couldn't. That number jumps out at you. You know what I mean, from a standpoint of just overall performance.
Yeah, I think you keep saying the term ESG, and I think that those who are really, the cool kids know about ESG, we're paying attention to it. Maybe just give a quick summary for people what you're referring to and why the introduction of the carbon index might start to change a builder's concept of how they're building for the purpose of ESG.
Right. So ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance, is basically something that's really been adopted by the stock market. So it's really, I think it is also applies to private builders, but mostly publicly traded builders are focusing on this greatly, because now there's a grading system where companies are graded on their ESG. So I think that, one of the, over the last few years, being in these meetings and understanding how important it is to all these builders to have a good ESG score. A big part of it is using, the HERS rating and the results of this, and now probably the carbon index, in order to demonstrate, environmental, good in their incorporation, and improvement over time is really the key, right? So I would say that, that's a very simple explanation of it. But when it pertains to a HERS rating or, energy efficiency or building performance, that's where they're really looking at it. And it's with these things being measured at the rate they are, and there's a lot of things going on with this, right? There's presently now 30 different ways to measure ESG in the corporate world, maybe more than that now. But there are some builder-focused things going on right now, and there is also some legislation where it may be standardized, which may change it again a little bit. But it's become the hot topic du jour when it comes for investment, and a lot of people want to invest in companies that are really following a strict protocol of ESG. So that's basically my nutshell explanation.
Yeah, and right
I would
now,
say one thing.
Publicly traded builders are using the HERS index, right, for the purpose of their ESG reporting. So, we've started to hear about builders that maybe were just code compliance builders that have started to basically get all their homes rated, because it allows them to basically submit to different ESG reporting systems, more or less that they are a responsible home builder. Now, just imagine if there was more sort of consensus process, and what happens if we arrived at the RESNET Carbon Index as being that really that reporting mechanism. Maybe the HERS index itself starts to be looked at less so, and maybe the carbon index over time becomes more important, man, that would be crazy. Because like if I'm, big builder X, that builds all across the country, I'm building in Metro Detroit. Well, it kind of doesn't really matter if I'm gas or electric. I might even go for the gas just because they're close enough, and I know that the consumer won't be concerned about the cost of their bills. They might not be sticker shocked. But if I'm in Iowa, and then all of a sudden I'm looking at a 115 point spread between the HERS index and the carbon index, and between electric and gas, I'm looking at over 100 points difference. I mean, I don't know that I can use gas anymore. If all of a sudden the carbon index matters, I may have to start to find strategies and solutions to bring more high performance heat pumps, heat pump water heaters and things like that, because I got to deliver a cost comparable product, for the consumer. They can't be paying dramatically more in bills, but if this matters, if the CO2 index matters for ESG purposes, then, all of a sudden I gotta be paying a little bit more close attention to this. What do you think, Sandy?
No, I think that's exactly where it's heading. I don't know how much it's being paid attention to now. I mean, this is a beta version, and they're still working it through. But I actually think that this is a giant opportunity for HERS raters, though, right? And I think the reason why is because now even the small rater can give the customer pretty easily accessible. I mean, if you get it put into your Ekotrope at this point, it automatically comes up when you calculate your HERS rating, and you can supply the customer with this data, which before it was like, trying to perform an Olympic feat, try to calculate it out. So I think, there's a lot of benefits there. There is some parts I'm disappointed in. I think that the exclusion of embodied carbon is an issue. I mean, it's like, I don't know, 10 or 11% of global emissions, are not counted for with this, in the building industry. And like a quarter of the emissions from a home are not even accounted for in this calculation either. And I think it may come down to that. It may come down to that.
Clarification, this is just embodied carbon. But
what I'm saying is that I think it may come down to force where they're looking at that too. And what that's going to do is, and I've already seen this in a previous company I was dealing with, where people are starting to question supply chain emissions and, what that effect that is. And so, I mean, I think that the conversation is definitely going there, and then you open up like a whole world, right, of, supply chain, that what happens in the supply chain and how does that affect the end product. And, we get down to rail versus trucks versus, I mean, it gets, I think it gets more complicated. But I think it becomes a factor eventually, because again, that's 11% is 11%. A quarter of the building's emissions would make a big difference in this calculation. So again, but I think it's an awesome tool. I know if I was a rater, if I was a building performance professional, if I was, I would be all over this, because this is, a way that you can not only give a great service to your client, but make their life easier. And, if you really become an expert at, do analysis like you just did, Chris, in your expert way, I think that, you could really help guide your builder to making better decisions, not only for the future, but for their customers.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. So, I mean, the topic that you're bringing up about, embodied carbon, I think is really important. The CO2 index is only looking at operational carbon. Embodied carbon is a topic that is being taken up by RESNET is working with some other players in the industry, like the Rocky Mountain Institute, to try to come up with a standard for calculating embodied carbon within the residential sector. Let's switch over really quick to just one last example. So we're going to go from Iowa to Massachusetts. So if we go from Iowa to Massachusetts, the HERS index goes up slightly in the gas example, but it's almost the same. The carbon index, though, comes down quite a bit. So it just goes to show you, that really the electric grid up in in Iowa, the Upper Plains states has gotten a lot cleaner over time and is projected to long term, basically, become the wind belt, I guess, of the country. Switching over to the all electric example, we've got, again, almost the exact same, score, if we're going for just sort of a moderate performance heat pump and a tank electric water heater. Again, the big thing that jumps out to me, though, is
wow,
$3,600 per year for the electric home versus $2,200. So again, I mean, that is a big difference in terms of cost. And, you're talking about adding 60% or so onto people's, energy bills. And this is something that's really interesting because the state of Massachusetts is actually moving very prolifically towards, basically pushing electrification. The stretch code in Massachusetts has a forthcoming, starting next year, a tiered based HERS index target, where if you have an all electric home, your HERS index score is allowed to be, I believe, a 45. But if you're a mixed fuel home, and you have gas appliances, then you have to hit a 42. So they're really kind of, I think, encouraging people to go all electric, which is great. And, the one thing I will say is once you get to those lower HERS index levels, HERS indices in the 40s, you tend to have a combination of airtight homes, usually balanced heat recovery ventilation, and usually better building enclosures, to the point where the cost of heating is just less because our heating load is smaller. Yeah. So, the truth is, if we were to look at one of those examples, it may turn out that there is more parity overall in annual energy costs. But, this is going to be a big wake-up call, I think, for builders in that region, because, if you're used to doing gas, which a lot of people still are, while I'll say that, I think there's more consciousness about electrification in the Northeast, there's still a lot of people who are building brand new homes with gas furnaces and gas water heaters and whatnot. So, now if all of a sudden, we're starting to look at, the value of long-term carbon emissions more so, the builders may have to kind of, change their perspective in the way that they're looking at all this very quickly. How do you see that really affecting, maybe not the big national builders who have the kind of the luxury of maybe more support staff and really, valuable rater partners that are looking at a national profile? What happens if you're just kind of like a mid-sized builder or even a small-time builder in a place like Massachusetts? What do you make of this data?
Well, I think number one, you better get a good rater, right, to help you out. I think that's, key. And I think that it puts the smaller builder a little bit out of a disadvantage because they don't have the buying power, right? So, for instance, if I'm, X builder and I build, 50,000 homes a year or 20,000 homes a year, I have tremendous buying power. So if I get to switch to heat pumps, I'm getting a deal, because the manufacturers are going to give it to me. If I'm building 400 homes a year or 200 homes a year, I am not going to get that same economy of scale. So I think that it sort of disadvantages a small builder a little bit. But then smaller builders tend to be more boutique builders, and they usually build a little bit better product or a little bit more custom product. So it may not affect them as much because of that, right? Because their clientele is at a higher level of income, But I mean, somewhere in there, the rubber's going to meet the road, right? I mean, it's going to get to the point where if it's ever, mandated that these measures, take place, then it might be a different story. You know what I mean? The other thing I would say is, and I would like your perspective on this actually is, what happens if like these utility rebate companies or even some of these, other jurisdictions start to manage a minimum, CO2 index? That would be interesting. And it's a possibility.
think about, if you are a utility provider that is in the game of selling electricity. Let's just be honest. It's big business, and there's a lot of value in saying that they are good corporate stewards. State regulators, through different schemes that happen, and every state's a little bit different, but usually there's a public service commission,
Right.
oftentimes that is looking at scrutinizing the utilities, and are you, as a utility, keeping up with making sure that consumers have reliable power, and that they have increasingly more less carbon intensive power, greener fuels, less pollution. So yeah, could I see a Mid-American Energy in Iowa say, let's create a CO2 index program where we can claim all these savings? Because if your baseline is gas, right? And I think you could say that, right?
I mean, which one is more valuable to them? A low HERS score, okay? And this is my point. You hit it right on the head as always. My point is this: to a utility company, what's more valuable? A low carbon index that they can report in their ESG, or a HERS rating?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that the HERS rating has been sort of a rough surrogate for performance.
But I think you see where I'm going with it.
Oh, I totally see where you're coming from. What's really important, and I think this is going to start to matter more, because, the HERS index, here we go. We go from Michigan, 62, to Iowa, a 62, to Boston, a 64 on the HERS index in the gas scenario. It kind of all is like the same score. We look at the electric, 71 in Massachusetts, 69 in Iowa, and then 69 in Detroit. Again, more or less the same score. You're not getting any credit or penalty for really what your local grid is because of this fuel neutrality, the baked-in fuel neutrality. Basically, it all just comes down to, the comparison of climate zone, reference home to rated home characteristics, as well as, the specific location where the home is built. Like Des Moines and Detroit, are looking like they're pretty close because the HERS index comes out the exact same. Versus in Boston, there's some minor differences overall in terms of, energy intensity of Boston, even though they're all climate zone 5A. But yeah, all of a sudden, if I'm Mid-American, Energy, and I'm seeing that I could promote a program where saying, hey, the baseline home is gas, but hey, if you do a all electric home, we're going to get 100 points of savings on this. That's huge. That is a huge,
gigantic.
And if they're able to, be persuasive to a public service commission, then yeah, all of a sudden, I think to your point, what matters to the utility, they want to look like good corporate stewards too. They report ESG as well, and they have to report to the Public Service Commission. Yeah, so if they can look good to the Public Service Commission, and they can look good in ESG reporting mechanisms, then maybe that's really what starts to shift the narrative. You combine the possibility, and again, we're being theoretical. We hope that someone from Mid-American is listening to this episode, because they may get some good ideas here. But they could just say, "Hey, we'll give you $2,000 to put in a heap, or $5,000." Who knows?
What about this though? What about this, Chris? What about this part? And your point is well taken. What about all the areas that currently don't have utility rebates? Are they going to start to appear based on the carbon index? Yeah. So again, my prediction would be yes.
Hold a second, Sadie. We're going to have to start charging for this podcast. This is valuable. This is gold. This is diamonds here, man. Y'all are lucky listening to the BERcast. You're getting some good information here on what the future could look like. Maybe some of these utilities could learn a thing or two, because all of a sudden we're sounding like geniuses over here.
It's just I look at everything like a businessman. I'm a businessman, right? And when I first read this, I just said to myself, that's a giant opportunity, right? I mean, HERS index are great. I think it's a great thing. But like, if I can meet my ESG goals, look, they buy carbon credits now, right? I mean, what happens if you could do it through a rating if you were a builder or a utility? I mean, just think about that for a minute. That has huge ramifications, especially in states like Texas and Florida, where they build tons of houses, the whole smile of the U.S., right? I mean, it has gigantic ramifications. And if I'm Joe utility expert, I'm looking at this and going, wait a minute, that's worth a couple $1,000 to me, because now we're not struggling to get ESG, credit or whatever you want to call it, from other places. And it helps us out, from, the reporting utilities and, through the commission and, our stance publicly. It's a lot, so there's a million, I could see a million ways that, and we haven't even gotten to like the privately held, companies. So, I mean, again, that are corporately traded mostly. So it's a lot. And I just hope that, our industry is really looking at this with a wide view, because I think that this really has potential to be gigantic for our industry, as long as we promote it, and we make sure that we're due diligence. I mean, there's other issues that could come into play here. Let's be honest, modeling consistency, software consistency. I mean, there's other issues. It's not perfect, but I think it's a big step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to continue to kind of monitor this situation. This is in beta right now, so it could turn out that some of these numbers shift a little bit over time. But honestly, the way I'm looking at it, actually, it makes a lot of sense. Or at least I'll say the data is consistent with what we're seeing from some of these other sources like NREL's data. And so, over time, we may be having a completely different conversation about really what index are we even using. The HERS index, I don't know, maybe viewed as a little bit more niche in some ways over time. Maybe some of these utilities really do start to look at the carbon impact of the CO2 index. So we'll keep an eye on it.
And programs.
All right, and so wrapping it up, part 3, Sandy and my 5-minute musing here. So Sandy, we've been, kind of taking the time to talk about some serious things, I would say. Let's talk about something totally not serious right now. So
I can't wait. Full disclosure, I have no idea what Chris is going to ask me right now. So
yeah, my hometown team that happens to share some similar colors as the hat that I'm wearing. They didn't look so good this past weekend, but overall, the Detroit Lions, can you believe it? 5-2. They are looking like they may actually not be a total embarrassment this year. They may actually do something. What do you think? Is it all hype? Early schedule bias, or do you think that they got some legs?
I think they have some legs. I mean, I think I got a little more concerned about Detroit after watching Minnesota thump 49ers last night. I think that raised a flag to me a little bit. Like if Minnesota, with the few additions they made and they've just been playing better, they could be, look at last year, they were 13-4 or whatever, I mean, they were a good team. And, thankfully, my Giants went in and beat them in the playoffs. But, I think the Lions are absolutely for real. I think the Lions could win that division easily. Not easily, but pretty easily. And I think they're a for real team. I think this is actually maybe the best thing that could have happened to them. They needed to get there. Well, what did the coach say? We needed to get punched in the mouth to wake up and get out of this fantasy, And I think in a lot of ways, you see teams do that, They take that hard loss, and they either act two ways. We're going to find out this week, right? The 49ers, not so good, right? I mean, they thumped the Cowboys, and then they've looked horrible the last 2 games. Well, not horrible, but, not as good.
Yeah, I mean, they lost to two teams that on paper they should have beat for sure.
They should have never lost to them. And, and then, we're going to see what the Lions look like this week, right? I mean, I'm curious to see. I think Campbell will have them out there and ready to go.
Monday Night Football, night before Halloween. I may actually be in the building at Ford Field. We'll see. I got a buddy of mine who we're thinking about making it out to the game. So, what about the Giants? Giants were looking not so exciting at the beginning of the season. They've kind of stepped up a little bit, though, right?
Well, they won against Washington this week, 14-7. I called it the Suck Bowl. But Giants are not a good team. I mean, they're not. I mean, I think last year, Dable, I think he, as a coach, he took a lot of people by surprise, but they got a book on him now, and they got a book on Daniel Jones. And I think and plus they don't have a very good team. They have no offensive line. They have, a suspect defense line at best. Barkley was just back this week. It's ironic he shows up and they win, but then he'll be out for 3 more games hurt. The guy's constantly hurt. And I mean, he's their biggest threat. Waller, I mean, he looks good. He had 9 catches or something on Sunday. He looks good. He's a great pickup from the Raiders. But I would say that they're not a good team. Not a good team.
Okay.
So who's your favorite in the AFC?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my heart always is a Bills supporter, but man, they're making it hard for me to really be a supporter. So for those who don't know, Detroit and Buffalo, we got some love for each other. Similar stories, similar kind of architecture, similar rise to population. Similar. Though they got us beat when it comes to the amount of snow, but a similar amount of cloudiness for sure. But I had some family ties to Western New York, so I was always kind of a Bills fan. And man, I wish that I could say that I'm feeling really good about them, but I'm not so sure. Not beating the Patriots, that gives me some pause. That maybe they're going to be going through a little bit of regression here. So. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are down on the Chiefs and think that they don't have the pieces.
It's ridiculous, I think. I mean, so they're not winning by 40, every game. They're no good. I mean, I don't know, man. That's a pretty good team, if you ask me.
Yeah, no, obviously, at the Ravens, I'd say it was a statement win. Beating the Lions any other time in history, nobody would really care about it. But the fact that they took a team that really had shown a lot of maturity, especially offensively, and then to hold them to 6 points, 2 field goals, for the entire game, and to put up, almost 40 points on top of them.
What's your opinion of Jared Goff?
I think he's been more than any Lions fan could have ever hoped for, to be honest. I think that he was sort of considered to be a salary match, not really much else, that really, we were getting the picks out of it and it was just going to be kind of a prolonged rebuild, so the fact that, and he's been playing really good. I mean, overall, I think he actually had the least amount of interceptions last year in the NFL of all quarterbacks, or at least a ratio
6 or something, right? It was like
So I mean, now here's the thing: he's kind of one-dimensional. He can't really run. I think that we have given him a lot of benefit of having a healthy offensive line early in the season. So we'll see whether or not they can rebound from this, but quarterback, I don't have any complaints. He's steady. He's not necessarily a phenom, but he's steady. And, when you're a Lions fan, I mean, name your top 3 favorite Lions quarterbacks of the last, you can't, right?
Stafford. I mean, that's the only one. I liked him. I like Matthew, but other than that, I can't really think of another one,
Yeah.
Ever. The lefty back in the day, Mitchell, or whatever his name was.
Yeah,
I thought he was pretty good.
Scott Mitchell, but you're talking about 30 years ago.
I'm just saying, that's how bad it is.
I understand, but that's what I'm saying. So, you asked me, how do we feel about Jared Goff? He might be the 3rd best quarterback that we've had in 30 years. And maybe even the 2nd best, and he could potentially even, Stafford had some really great comeback wins,
Yeah.
That's about all you could really say for him in terms of his resume while here. What about the NFC? So I still think the Chiefs are probably the team to beat. I mean, they're the defending champs. They may not be off to the hottest start, but I'm still going to put my faith that they're going to turn it up when it matters. What about the NFC?
Well, I'm not going to jump on the Cowboys bandwagon. That's for damn sure. Every year is the Cowboys year. Tired of hearing that. I really thought it was going to be the 49ers. I really did until this last game. And then I'm like, maybe they're figuring it out Purdy, And that's the trend in the NFL, right? A quarterback comes in, he's new. He wins a bunch of games, and then all of a sudden they figure the book out on him. They figure out how to stop him, right? I mean, that's what they do. And then you'll see a digression usually in their play, unless they're great, like Mahomes or, somebody like that. I got to say that I think the Lions are going to make a strong playoff appearance. I don't see them going to the Super Bowl. I think the 49ers and the Cowboys are better teams than them, even though I'm not a giant Cowboy fan. And then but the team I think is going to win it all is going to be the Eagles. That's the one I think has got it.
Right.
I think they're the Super Bowl contender. I think we're going to see the Eagles and the Chiefs. That's what I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue against them right now. I mean, they're really taking care of business. And other than that sloppy loss to the Jets, but hey, look, everybody's going to have a letdown every once in a while. It's tough to go undefeated. So, all right. Well, yeah, I think you and I are probably, we're not exactly, making any radical prognostications here. So it probably goes to show how much I really know and care ultimately about football. The truth is, being from Detroit, I've always kind of been like, I don't have that much to root for. I like sports. I like the game. I went to MSU, and I don't have very much to root for with college football this year because they've got plenty of problems and not a whole lot of winning going on in East Lansing. So I'm on the Lions bandwagon, for better or worse. We'll see where it takes me.
I think they're going to make some noise. I just don't see them going to the Super Bowl this year. I think next year might be their year.
Okay. Wow. Okay. You heard it here first. Okay.
I'm making my prediction.
Well, we're going to keep talking about, what's ever on our mind as the season goes on, with the BERcast. We appreciate y'all giving a listen. Continue to listen and subscribe, do all that good stuff with giving us 5 stars and all the rest like that. The main thing is we want to get the news out to you because this is your industry too, and we want you to stay informed. So we will catch you for episode 5 here in the next couple weeks, and we'll talk to you then.
See you soon, everyone.